Thank you, Nicola, for hosting us. In fact, this is part of Italy here in Austria, so we are very glad. And part of Italy, of course, I have to thank Stefano Beltrame, our bilateral ambassador, for being here, and Alessandro Cortese, the UN ambassador, Italy UN ambassador, for being here. So the three ambassadors are here. We are well represented, and thank you all for coming. I would say the diplomatic corps of the OSCE is very well represented. I'm very glad. I hope that this is a good investment for you, because time for us is so important. So this is big responsibility. Thank you for clapping in advance. I hope you will also clap after all this exercise. But the idea today is to use this wonderful occasion of presenting a book to hear a little bit not only of history but also of reflections and observations. That's why around this table I'm surrounded by very knowledgeable people, starting from, of course, the author of the book. Sorry, I have to say the book is only in Italian, but we will speak in English. So, and you can always learn a little bit of Italian. But anyway, it's just an excuse to mention many issues. And Ambassador Antonio Armellini is with us. I will introduce him very soon, because he will be the first to start. All the other friends that are around the table, starting from Lamberto Zanier, Matteo Mecacci, Gliassani. I will also introduce them very briefly, because you know everything about them, all the good things, because there are no bad things to know. So that's why I'm saying. This book is the idea of this book comes from several reflections. The first one is that there was some very interesting material, thanks to Ambassador Armellini, that was available, which is not only material which was produced at that time when the Paris Charter was being negotiated, but also his own memories, which is even more important, because that's what you generally lose. What has happened, or what is the recollection of what happened at that time. This is more than recollection, because there are many things that he will say were just noted at that time. So this is, when he proposed this possibility, of course we jumped on it, and it was a long work of preparation, editing and everything else, but I think finally we have a very good product, which is available also online. If you read this leaflet that we have prepared, and I had here just before, thank you, you will notice that there are two QRs. One is for downloading the book, which you can do for Italian speakers, and the other one is also interesting, because the book is complemented by a series of documents. I think some of them quite unique in the sense that they are very difficult to find, that were collected, which are interventions sometime, or known papers, these sort of historical things which can give you an idea. Of course, this can be useful certainly for researchers, but just to give you an idea that you have a broad view of what happened in 1990 and right before. That was the idea at that time. And I'm not going to speak much longer than this, because the discussion is going to take different avenues depending on what will be said. And I want to hear more than to talk. Whatever I forget to tell you, I will complement later on. The idea is to have each one, starting from Ambassador Armellini, each one of the other discussants, let's call them discussants, but anyway, friends speaking about any kind of inspiration which comes from the book, of what has happened at that time or is happening today, which can be related to that time. And then we will have some questions from you, or observations, or whatever you want to share with us, provided that you don't ask us to solve any of the current problems of the OSCE, because this is not the place, and we will have many other occasions. But certainly things will come up one way or another. So, without spending more time speaking, let me say 2 words about Ambassador Armellini. Again, you will find a broader, even if short, biography in the leaflet that we prepared. But Ambassador Armellini has a long experience not only in the negotiation of CSCE, but also in many other postings that he had. He was ambassador to Algeria, he was special envoy to Iraq, not in an easy time, if ever there was an easy time in Iraq.
An interesting time.
Interesting time, yes.
Chinese
I would say interesting time, yes. And then he was ambassador to India and Nepal. And then he ended up with OECD in Paris. And of course, needless to say, he's still very much active in many. He has published several books, even in English. One on India, which is still extremely used and can be bought. So he is very well certainly informed to tell us a bit not only the story of the book, but what's in the book and why it comes out, and whatever you want to add. Thinking of what you see today, if you want. But it's up really to you. The only thing which is not up to you is the time that you have, because after 10 minutes I will stop you and I will pass to the others, but of course you will be able to react even later on if you want to, and certainly you will add something or with the questions. Thank you again, Ambassador Armellini, for accepting this, first of all, to do the book, and then to be here with us today. It's a really a very good occasion, and thank you to all the colleagues who are here. Really, I really hope you make the best of it. Thank you. Ah, sì. Yes. Dovrebbe funzionare. No, I think it works. Try it. Sì.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and thank you all for the patience of coming to listen this evening to the Institute to listen to this conversation. I think, Stefano, your presentation is an excellent presentation. Most of it is untrue. The only true thing is that I'm an old man. But having said that, that's the way it is, and that is what I am. Why this book? There's a number of reasons, and I will start with the Euro-Italian chauvinist touch. The Charter of Paris was one of the first, I think, fruits of the developing European political cooperation, which had one of its first tests during the negotiation. And it came out with flying colours, because in fact the Charter of Paris is largely a construct of the EU 12. And Italy had a role at that time. We had the presidency. It was a fairly active presidency. We had a very dynamic foreign minister. I had very good colleagues who compensated for my weaknesses, and therefore we went along and had a result which proved that EPC, as we call that at that time, it's now something else, could in fact play a role, and did play a role at that time. And it played a role at a time of extraordinary events, as we all know, when things were about to change, and they had not changed entirely, but there were expectations that they would change very fast. Actually, even if you think the way in which the Charter of Paris was conceived and the negotiations started is an interesting way, because it starts with a Soviet intention. So it is Mr. Gorbachev who first, it goes back for a number of years, Mr. Gorbachev who proposes the Charter of Europe. It's the Americans who resist the idea of a Charter of Europe. It's the Europeans who come into play and push forward with some shades of different opinion within its member states. And then that evolves as the situation evolves, and the Americans become strong supporters of the negotiations, and the Soviets become passive, positive participants. You could see at that while things developed how the situation was changing in Europe under our eyes, day by day. The book is a day-to-day account of the negotiations. So it follows the negotiation day by day, and it gives you an impression of how things were going on, how compromises were made, which the hurdles were, how you were going to go to one or other points. But
and our predecessors, what were they doing?
Well, yes, I mean, for fun, if you want, I sketched out stories of all of what I can remember of my colleagues, some of which were colourful, most of which are excellent, some were extraordinary, and what I could remember I put down. But you could see things change. You saw Europe growing at that time. You saw another fundamental change in the CSCE's pattern was the waning of the neutral and non-aligned countries, because it was first negotiation in which there was no mediation role left for them. And so they were interested, they were active, but their role was in fact nullified in many ways by the fact that indeed they had a role as members, but no longer a particular role as a group. The other distinct point was to see how the Eastern European system unraveled day by day, because the Eastern European countries, the new democracies, how they started to call themselves at that particular time, were in fact amongst the most active opponents on many of the points which were put forward by the Eastern group, as it was still called at that time. And this, nevertheless, despite the fact that the groupings formally still existed, there was a European Union caucus, there was a NATO caucus, there was a Warsaw Pact caucus, and there was a neutral and aligned caucus. In the book, I tell the story, which is rather amusing, if you want, of what happened in the Eastern European caucus. Because we had extensive cooperation amongst ourselves, the 12 and the 16, as they were called at that time. We had intensive cooperation in a dialectic way, if I put it that way. So we had an intense but complicated cooperation. It was sometimes very difficult to get the positions together. So we negotiated amongst ourselves for a long time, and that had a very important impact on how the things went on day to day. Now, the Eastern European caucus took far less time to negotiate, because the Soviet Union would put a point forward, which would be ignored by the others. But then I had a rather interesting inside view, which I will tell you, which I think I find one of the most amusing things I brought back from that negotiation, because in the Eastern European caucus, the model was that the Soviet ambassador would give the line, and the others would listen, and then move over to a drink, waiting for the rest of us, means the Europeans and NATO, to get their act together, which took enormous amount of time. And they could not understand, she was an insider amongst themselves, why on earth we lost that much time? How is it that the Americans had not at one point say, no, enough, that's the end of it, and let's go on. And that in itself gave an idea of how things were moving in that direction. So that day-to-day account gives you an indication of all the things which happen, and it shows, if one is able to read the book, sadly in Italian, but if one can read the book, I think as you go, if you follow the days, you see how the pattern is developing. The pattern was that of bringing forward the outcome of the results of the Helsinki process and turning them into a sort of future positive kind of mode. Now, I firmly believe, I may be wrong, that the Helsinki process began on the basis of a double premise, which ended up in a win-win situation, unexpectedly maybe. The double premise was, on the one side, the Brezhnev the Soviet priority was that of obtaining a legitimation of the suzerainty, not sovereignty, of the Soviet Union on its bloc. Kissinger's line was that of inserting an element of instability in the Eastern European domination through the tool of individual rights. And on that principle, a relationship between two blocs, which had come to a point where there was not much scope any longer for further confrontation. Each had achieved the ultimate aims of what they could have in that present situation. So there was a possibility of opening a venue for moving from confrontation to cooperation, and it was done on the basis of the double premise. Each thought that something could happen, and each at one point, both sides did win at one point, because the Soviet Union did legitimize their role in Eastern Europe, and the West had very little to say about what happened. The Americans were extremely critical of the Helsinki process at the beginning, because they felt that, in fact, the United States had given way to the Soviet Union without any gain. Of course, that little weasel, which was inserted there at the end of the day, turned out to be the winning weasel, and the thing changed all. But the point I would like to make, and which I think is interesting in today's context, is that the point was we were able to start that negotiation I'm talking about 1972, I'm talking about how the Helsinki in Dipoli and so on, because the two blocs decided that there was greater advantage in seeking ways of living together, other than trying to seek further positions of power advantage within their own camp. And that they were able to do that because they found themselves in a situation where each of the two sides could put forward that they were in fact on the winning side. And that is how negotiation is carried out. That's how the negotiation is won. And if you look at all this and put it in a contemporary context, you see that there's a number of lessons you can draw from this, and maybe also some possible way ahead. So this is when I started writing the book, I'm afraid all the things we have now had not happened yet, but still there was a situation where the situation was fraying at the end in many ways, and one had to see how you could move ahead, because that win-to-win proposition, which made the Helsinki final act and the Helsinki proposition possible, had come to a point where it had to be renovated, and rejuvenated. That is what the Paris Charter was meant to be to me all about. And in fact, it appeared that it could be actually work, because we were moving in new territory, where nothing was certain, but things were moving in a way, and we're moving towards a possible cooperative in many ways. The word cooperative has been used in CSCE in many ways, so please don't take it in any of its official denominations. But there was a way of moving from a stalemated confrontation turned into a cooperation, into a cooperative relationship in which both sides started sharing the same values which they had all subscribed to with different readings. The readings of those values were to become more homogeneous than they were in the past. That was the assumption. It could have worked. Of course, the Yugoslav crisis took care of that. And that is when the whole process started unraveling. Then when 2 years later in Helsinki, the following meeting, the Helsinki 2, the real Helsinki 2 as it was called, met together, it could just sort of piece together the ruins of what had been done so far, and set up the CSCE in different course. And it was not the end of the CSCE, it was the change at the end of a specific project which had used a system which had proved its mettle for over 25 years, tried to adapt it to the situation, and see how you could move ahead. Moving ahead was a different story, and then you'll know what happened after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we also move ahead now. I know that there are many other things, and there are a lot of other things in the book, and we will hopefully be digging some more. But if I can introduce or suggest Lamberto, but you can say whatever you want. But I would like to ask you, how do you see the impact of the Paris Charter for? Moving ahead, as you were saying, what happened? But you're free even to touch on other things. What you're not free, you will have from 5 to 8 minutes. Right. So I will tell you in 8 minutes.
First of all, thank you for having me with you. I was not in Paris, I was not involved in drafting the charter, but I was in the CSCE in the 80s here in Vienna for a couple of years, at the time when the Soviets were talking about the common European house. So in a way the charter reflects these ideas. And then I was back in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, in the delegation, in the Italian mission to the OSCE. But in the meantime, one of the things I did, I spent 6 years in NATO. In NATO, I was head of the department dealing with arms control, but also dealing with cooperative security, hence the OSCE, or the CSCE first, the OSCE. So I was looking at the OSCE from a NATO perspective, which was an interesting thing. So the Paris Charter was obviously a watershed for the OSCE. It changed a number of things. First of all, it brought together the membership with all the distinguishes that Antonio was making. But there was a common vision emerging, and a common vision which reflected more or less everybody's idea of the new setup, the new European setup. It institutionalized the OSCE, started creating a number of mechanisms. Actually, it's thanks to the Paris Charter that we are all here today, because creating the consultative committee, etc., the CPC as a first step, solidified the presence of the OSCE in Vienna while maintaining the other, or creating the other institutions in other places.
Roberto, one of the most drawn-out battles was deciding where to place the institutions.
Yes, I know. Still, when I was Secretary General, I still had the marches to try to revitalize this or that, or maybe open something else. Institutionalize the OSCE was an important part of the thing. But what really strikes me still today was the fact that after the Paris Charter, there was really a community of states trying to operate in unison. The fact that those countries agreed to mechanisms like consensus -1, but not only agreed to those mechanisms, or the Moscow mechanisms, etc., but also agreed to the implementation of those. When the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was suspended, everybody else agreed, including Russia. Which is an interesting consideration. Russia, as you heard, or the Soviet Union at the time of Paris, was not perhaps the key actor, and I take the point on the European Union's key role. But Russia started developing its own plan, and we could see it evolving also in NATO. I could see that Russia was looking at the new security setup in Europe, where for them the OSCE should have taken the role of a regional UN, should have been the highest ranking institutions, hence the Charter and the transformation, what led also to the transformation of CSCE into the OSCE, which was in fact a failure because not much was achieved through that. They even failed. I kept saying the OSCE is a unique international organization because it has no member states. It still has participating states as if it were still a conference. So in fact, that transformation was very superficial and was not the kind of basis for the creation of the really strong European institutions, because a number of Western countries, and you mentioned the United States in particular, were opposing the idea of a charter, of transferring everything on a legal basis, etc. So these are flaws that unfortunately we bring from that time and have hampered in a number of ways also the full effectiveness of the organization, even though I thought, maybe also because I'm Italian and I'm happy to operate in environments that are flexible, where you can play with the tools that you have more freely somehow. And I found the lack of the legal personality at the end of the day was not such a big handicap. But certainly frustrations on the side of Russia started mounting over the time. The crisis, the conflict in Yugoslavia was only the beginning of it, but Russia kept trying. I remember in NATO, Russia was really engaging to try to forge a close relationship with NATO. There were people in Moscow at the time of Yeltsin, and at least in the first half of the 90s, the Russians seemed interested to find a strong, a solid arrangement with NATO. But of course, the condition was that NATO should be reformed. That it should become a kind of a cooperative defense organization supporting the UN in peacekeeping and the ground for cooperation in the defense area among countries. And of course, this was not the vision that prevailed, and and when things went in a different direction with the enlargement and in agreement with Russia that Russia always considered rather unsatisfactory. In fact, this also weakened in a way the relationships, and that's something we felt also in the OSCE. The crisis in the second part of the 90s did the rest, of course. They strengthened then the more nationalist side of the Russian political elite, and then we have seen what happened in the OSCE. Interestingly, and something I've been pointing out a number of times, this effort to continue the basis of the spirit of Paris produced a number of ministerial councils and summits throughout the 90s and into the beginning of the new century. And every time ministers or heads of states managed to agree on common documents. The last one being in 2002. And after that, nobody ever managed to agree on anything. So that was really the negative watershed in the OSCE, and in a way the loss of the idea of a community. So this is the time. Okay. So yeah, I know. I realize I could go for quite a bit of these things. But the Paris Charter still remains, in positive and negative things. The Paris Charter has scales of contribution that have led to quite difficult discussions here. So there are things that we have inherited from the Paris Charter that need to be looked at. But I think it's important also to look back at a time when there was this idea of a community of countries in Europe. We tried at the Astana summit to revive that, but it was too late, too little and too late. And so we need to look back at Paris. We had a big with the Parliamentary Assembly celebration in Paris for the this was the 20th anniversary. It was online, unfortunately, due to COVID. But it's important to keep in mind this vision, and hopefully at some point conditions will re-emerge to try to move a little bit more in that direction again. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamberto. Thank you. I know there is much more than this, but we have to take pieces and then see what will be the result of the puzzle at the end of these exchanges. And just to take some more pieces, we have heard, what happened, the impact, but also the situation. And the situation today is very different, or not. And this is what I would like to challenge Matteo with. How do you see the differences? What is there anything that we can take, or what we can learn, or we are in a completely different sphere? Thank you. Same rule,
yes,
8.
Yes. I'll try to be actually be briefer and on to the point. So thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss these issues. Of course, I was not in Paris, but I was a young student at the time.
Teenagers.
yes. But actually, I'm mentioning this because the events of those years led people like me to get interested in human rights. It's not. I'm not saying out of just to acknowledge this event, but really I think those were extraordinary times. Geopolitically, I don't think even in modern history. I'm not talking about the last decades. Even in the previous centuries, we haven't seen such a big geopolitical shift moving from authoritarian system towards democracy in such a short period of time. And I think the Charter of Paris is one of those documents, but Copenhagen in 1990, Moscow 1991, Istanbul 1992, those years countries were able to adopt and actually lay the foundations for the structures of the OSCE as it is today. Of course, there was something different before those events. There were no institutions, there was no secretariat, there was no organization as such. But it also created a huge set of commitments, political commitments of countries in the human dimension. And I think what is interesting to me as I was reflecting, what can I say, the commitments are still the same. They haven't changed. And we continue to try to implement them, to hold everyone accountable in good faith. But the geopolitical context now has changed drastically. So I think the reflection that you have to make, and as I do as director of Goodyear, how does it work? How do you try to do the same things the countries have agreed 30 years ago, today, where some of them are saying, actually, we wouldn't be in agreement if we had to do it today. And this is not just happening to the OSCE. This is happening in general, because in the 90s it was through the OSCE, but there was the creation of the first tribunals on war crimes, decision by the UN Security Council with Russia in favor, right? Rwanda, Yugoslavia. Then there was the International Criminal Court in Rome, 1998, landmine treaties, a whole set of rules that have been adopted. Now, the norms are still there. The political commitments are less. Of course, I also agree that they provide more space, but they're also more vulnerable because in a way, they are less stringent for countries. And this is happening in a way where you have two competing interests. You have the reality, the social life, health issues, environmental issues, economic issues. Everybody understands they cannot be dealt at the national level anymore. There are no national solutions to these issues. But at the same time, there is a strong pushback by national governments who are trying to regain their sovereignty. They're trying to challenge international institutions and to this global system that is trying to set these norms. And this is a tension that is happening now, but I think we have to be realistic. We cannot think that the implementation of those commitments, which was possible in the 90s to a certain extent, would be possible today. I think the national interests are pushing in a different direction. So how do we make sure that we preserve the commitments and the institutions that are mandated to work on this without breaking the agreement that was made at the moment? And I think this is a responsibility that especially like-minded countries, and many of you who are here, understand this, we have to keep in mind, because it's a very fragile situation where actually by trying to do the best, you may even end up in a worse situation. So I think this is something that in the current position I try to keep in mind as we are all temporarily here within the OSCE, especially heads of institutions. They expire very soon, traditionally, but it is important for me to
we want the fridge
as much as possible to preserve for who's coming next. And I think this is something that, especially about countries that are mindful of this, it's an important conversation to keep in mind moving forward. So I'll stop here and then hope for some feedback as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. Thank you very much, Matteo, for moving from the history and the spirit that we had at that time to what we are living today. But I think at that time there were many challenges as well. And then I'll get back to Ambassador Armellini. But before, of course, I want to hear Igli. He has the advantage that others, they have already commented. So I will not make any specific issue, but just what is coming to your mind for that time and for today, also based on your experience and what you are doing today in the institution as well.
I was a teenager at the time, and I bumped on Matteo Mecacci yesterday afternoon, and we started to calculate what we were doing at the time. But I remember every single day of the period of the book from July to November 1990, because in that period, my country was transforming dramatically. And in this wonderful book that I had the pleasure to read, because I speak
very well Italian, yes.
There are two major ghosts. One is Albania trying to become a member and is all pestering the kind Italian ambassador with our own diplomats, common diplomats. And there is the other strange ghost that Ambassador Armellini mentioned, that is the Soviet Union behaving well. Things that today, both these ghosts do not exist anymore. And when we look back in the 33 years of the existence of this organization, I can mention that this place, the OSCE, was chaired by a country that was once suspended, a country that refused to be part of it, and a country where the first mission was sent, the current chair. So it's impressive to see how things have changed. It's so nice to see day after day, from July to November, how negotiations for a wonderful document, an inspiring paper, the Paris Charter, were being developed. And it's wonderful even today for those that like to read the Paris Charter to find so many good things and elements that we continue to work. But as Matteo was saying a few minutes ago, these commitments are the same, but the behavior of the states, the participating states, have changed. On my personal histories, I went through many names in the book. I know personally Bob Frowick, one of the American actors in all these things. When I started to work in the Albanian public administration, he was the Chargé d'Affaires in Tirana. And I had the pleasure to know and work with Pierre Morel in his last engagement as our representative in the formats of the Trilateral Contact Group and with the SMM. And all that knowledge that has gone through, it's amazing to read and understand the developments on how this organization tried to develop. All those elements of the Paris Charter are now, I'm pretty sure, embedded in what the EU, NATO, and other organizations are doing. Meanwhile, what was the OSCE thought and planned and created failed. But at the same time, I personally think this entity that was struggling to find a seat for the CPC, be it in Berlin or whatever we can send in Warsaw or what Budapest can have and so on, with the current configuration is delivering quite a lot. Is trying to deliver not only in the institutions that we have in Vienna, Warsaw, and Hague, and our elements that we have in Prague, but also with the field missions in the entire area of the old Eastern Europe. The commitments are the ones that we have to continue to preserve. We don't see anymore facts differently. We see the facts diametrically opposing. We have one participating state that is fundamentally breaching the commitments day after day. And this is where we should find ways on how to continue. It's not the fault, or we cannot blame international organizations. The Paris Charter continues to be inspiring. It's the behavior of our members that is concerning, and we have to find a way to move forward. It's a wonderful book. I hope, Stefano, with your love for documents and history, you will make it translated in English. And I hope the circle of people will be open for more, and I'm pretty sure you know how to engage. It's not only the OSCE core people that continue to speak about our own issues every day, but many others. Going back 33 years is quite interesting. Those were very different times. I don't think the negotiations that we have been going through are so nice, prepared, thoughtful, deep. We have become very rigid. We have become very dry. We stick to very strong positions, and it's nothing in comparison with what was happening 33 years ago. But at the same time, we have to not go back. We don't go back to history. The panel looks a bit like in the 80s, but I think we have to find and we have to explore ways to make this place move forward for the greater good of the people that are suffering. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you, Ignis. Thank you very much. Yes, let's try to look positively to what we are doing today and for tomorrow. But I would like, before opening the floor for some questions, I would like to give a few minutes for any reaction on this, because I'm sure that the observations and the comments fostered many other thoughts. But just a few minutes, and then we see what in the other colleagues and other participants' minds have been developing during this time. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Stefano. Yes, I mean, this is a very interesting conversation and a lot of elements, but I'll try to pick up on just one or two. But I can't resist, but starting with the rhetorical point on the success of the Albanian negotiating process to get into this. In Vienna, we were way ahead. But your breakthrough was in Copenhagen, when you produced a fantastically efficient delegate who spoke flawless English with a British accent. Now that in itself was not crucial. What was crucial is that Albania sat next to America, because America is... And Albania had always been absent, and at one point during the Copenhagen meeting, this English voice kept coming from the America side. And we all said, what's happened to the Americans? I mean,
why did they change the accent?
Why did they change the accent? It took a while to understand. In fact, this was because it was the first time you were actually speaking, and this was not on the first day. And then it went very well. It went downhill very easily after that. But that Copenhagen, I think we all said, who is this strange American speaking in favor of Albania with an English accent? Anyway, on a more serious tone, I mean, Lamberto Zani and Matteo, they all made the point of Russia, the relationship with Russia, how all this changed. Well, Russia was weaker, Russia was cooperative because there was an attempt at that time to come to read from the same book. And that is what the Charter of Paris was all about. We're reading from the same book, and from there on you'd have to move. I distinctly remember, Lamberto might remember as well, when the first Soviet officers started circulating in NATO's headquarters in Brussels. And I remember going to NATO and finding Soviet officers in the room. I said, what is all this? And it was a time in which there was, I think, a serious attempt by the still Soviet Union to engage in a process in which they felt the need, rather than perhaps the principle, but the need to be part and engage. Now, what happened after that, I think we all know, and we are now on a very slippery slope whenever one talks about what happened to Russia. But I think if one looks at what happened many years later and why some states are now less prone than others to respect, you need to also have a look at what happened in those years between the end of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st, the Yeltsin years. What happened to democracy in Russia, how that developed, why are the root causes of what happened after that? I personally tend to believe there are, but I mean, in limiting ourselves to the OSCE process, that has a significant bearing. And it has changed the equation, because the equation is no longer the same. And that is a different thing we have to bear in mind. But I would just like to put in another point you might find interesting. The OSCE has not failed, the OSCE has changed. What has changed to me, and I'm a distant observer now, is that the political core of the consultation has failed in a way, but the technical side has gained a lot of impact. I mean, if Matteo will excuse me, ODIHR was an add-on in Paris. ODIHR, minorities, we have this big political body, and let us add on some bits and pieces so that we get it working. Now, the bits and pieces are now the core of the OSCE. Which means that the system has proved its validity in many ways. The political core is elsewhere, but that doesn't mean that you have to destroy it.
Well, it opens up many issues, what you just said, on the transformation, which is certainly true, and I would like to hear who wants to add on or start and comment. Matteo.
No, because he was by the way, it was the Office for Free Elections, It was created as small, and I want to acknowledge because he was Ambassador Cortese. Yes, that's relative. He was the first.
Lucchino.
No.
Not him.
Lucchino, sì.
The uncle of Ambassador Cortese here, who was the first Odile director, which opened a very, very small office in Warsaw in 1991. So.
I think rightly so. We can measure time passing, also acknowledging many developments, as you said, in the organization, and they are very positive. Except that today we have to defend them. That's the one of the issues which has been touched.